Millionaire left his wife for a mistress and ended up witnessing something he'll never forget. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on more exciting stories like this, and leave a like on the video to keep watching. The soft melody of the violins filled the auditorium, a delicate combination of harmony and emotion. The notes seemed to float in the air, enveloping each person present at the small but sophisticated performance by the local orchestra. The city's historic theatre, with its red velvet seats and softly diffused golden lights, created an almost magical atmosphere. Everything was impeccable, planned to impress. But at that moment, Mark couldn't hear a thing. His gaze was fixed on the row next to the stage, where a soft light illuminated Claire. She was laughing, surrounded by admiring glances, as if she were the center of the universe, the woman he was proudly displaying like a glittering trophy. The fitted wine dress highlighted her curves, and the sapphire earrings sparkled under the theatre lights, making her look even more stunning. She knew she was wanted, and that filled her with satisfaction. "Are you all right?" Claire asked, sliding her fingers up his arm. Mark blinked a few times, pushing away any strange thoughts. "Yes, of course," he murmured. But his voice wavered. He should have been pleased. After all, everything around him reflected his rise. That performance was an important event in the city, bringing together influential businessmen and prominent cultural figures. Being there, alongside Claire, was an affirmation of status. He was respected, admired, and had a woman by his side who symbolized power and desire. So, why couldn't the discomfort go away? A strange sensation began to spread through his chest, as if something was out of place, something wrong, a persistent shadow that he couldn't ignore. And that's when it happened. The side door of the theatre opened. At first, no one noticed, but for Mark, time seemed to slow down. His eyes fixed on the entrance and his body went rigid. She was there. Evelyn, the woman he had spent years avoiding showing in public. The wife who had always made him feel uncomfortable, not because of who she was, but because of what she represented. A past he wanted to erase. She didn't fit the image he had built for himself. She was too simple, too ordinary. Or at least that's what he believed. Because now, looking at her under the golden lights of that theatre, Mark felt his stomach sink. Evelyn didn't look like the faded woman he'd left behind. She was radiant. The black and gold dress, elegant and without exaggeration, glided over her body with a natural lightness. Her hair fell in soft waves, and her eyes shone with a confidence he had never seen before. But what really struck him wasn't her appearance. It was the way she walked in, alone. As if there wasn't a single reason to hesitate, as if that was where she belonged. People began to notice her presence. Murmurs broke out among the guests. Some looked at her with surprise, others with curiosity, and there were those who frowned, trying to remember where they had seen her before. Evelyn didn't smile, she didn't try to attract attention. She was simply there, and that was enough to make all eyes gravitate towards her. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. What was she doing there? Why did she look so different? Next to him, Claire also noticed the change in atmosphere. Her fingers gripped his arm tighter. "Who is that?" The question came loaded with something Mark couldn't quite define. Jealousy? Insecurity? He didn't answer. His heart was pounding as he watched Evelyn approach the row of seats near the stage. Her every step carried a confidence he had never imagined she could have. He knew this woman, or at least he thought he did. But the Evelyn in front of him was not the faded wife he had left behind. She wasn't the woman who accepted being pushed aside, who settled for scraps of attention while he paraded around with Claire at events like that. The woman in front of him was a force he had never seen before, and that terrified him. Evelyn stopped near the side of the theatre, her posture impeccable. All eyes were on her, and one of the waiters hurried to offer her a glass of wine. She took the glass delicately, but unlike Claire, she didn't bother to look dazzling. It was natural, and perhaps that was what made it impossible to look away. "Mark?" Claire insisted, her voice laced with suspicion. "Who is this woman?" He sniffed, trying to regain control of his expression. "No one." It was a mistake to say that, because in the next instant, Evelyn's eyes met his, and she smiled. It wasn't a smile of greeting, nor was it sweet or embarrassed. It was a smile that said, "I know who I am," And now you do too. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine. She knew exactly what she was doing. The theatre seemed to get smaller. The air became thick. The sound of the orchestra, once an enveloping and welcoming melody, was now just a distant murmur. Something was about to happen and Mark could feel it. But what? And above all, what did Evelyn want with that appearance? Mark turned to the nearest waiter and picked up a glass of whiskey, drinking it in one gulp. He needed something strong. He needed to regain control of the situation. But how, when he felt he was about to lose everything? He remembered the day he made the decision to cut Evelyn out of his public life. At first, she was always by his side, believing they were a team. She attended dinners, smiled at investors, did everything to help him grow. But over time, Mark began to feel that she didn't fit into that world. Evelyn was simple. She didn't wear designer clothes like Claire. She didn't master the social codes of that superficial elite. She talked about dreams and purpose when the others only wanted to talk about money and power. He used to get irritated by this. Over time, this irritation turned into silent contempt. Evelyn didn't seem to understand that she didn't belong in that world. She didn't know how to behave. She didn't know the right people, and for Mark this was a constant source of frustration, until one day he simply stopped taking her. He convinced himself that it was for the best, that Evelyn was just a shadow from the past, a part of his life that he had outgrown. She belonged to a phase he'd rather forget. But now she was there, and she didn't seem out of place at all. "She's on her way here," Claire murmured next to him, with an uncomfortable tightness in her voice. Mark swallowed. Evelyn began to walk slowly down the steps of the auditorium. The performance had just gone into intermission, and the guests were spilling out into the theatre lobby, where drinks were being served, and small circles of conversation were forming. The event wasn't just a simple musical performance. It was a special evening, organized to raise funds for a cultural center in the city. Important figures were everywhere. Artists, businessmen, and politicians, all involved in some way with the project. And somehow Evelyn seemed to fit in much better than he remembered. People made way for her, not out of curiosity, but with a kind of silent respect. Some even greeted her with subtle nods, as if they had known her for ages. But how? Evelyn stopped in front of him. The silence between them weighed like lead. Mark tried to say something, but his voice caught in his throat. Before he could muster the courage to speak, a new voice echoed through the hall. "Evelyn, what a pleasure to see you here." Mark turned and saw Richard Coleman, an influential businessman who ran one of the largest cultural foundations in the region. Richard was a powerful figure, someone Mark admired but had never paid much attention to. The kind of person who only respected those who really made a difference. And now he was smiling at Evelyn as if they were old friends. "Richard," replied Evelyn, with the same naturalness of someone meeting a long-time acquaintance. "I'm glad to see you too." "You've done an incredible job at the community gallery," continued Richard. "The impact has been remarkable, especially with the art programs for young people. It's amazing how you've managed to get so many people involved." Mark felt a twinge in his stomach. Community gallery. "I'm just helping out where I can," said Evelyn with a modest smile. "Don't be modest." Richard laughed, pointing to one of the rest areas in the lobby where small high tables and armchairs were set up for guests to sit during the break. "Come with me. I need to hear more about this." Mark felt his face heat up. "What do you mean, come with me?" Richard Coleman, a man who had always treated him with indifference, was now summoning Evelyn for a chat as if she were a key player in the event. Claire noticed his discomfort and leaned closer. "What's going on?" she murmured. Mark couldn't answer. And then, as if the surprises of that night weren't enough, another figure appeared on the scene. He was tall with serious features and a presence that drew attention effortlessly. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark grey blazer, and his discreet but confident manner indicated that he knew exactly who he was, and that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Evelyn turned to him and smiled. "Nathan," she said with a softness that made Mark's stomach turn. The man took Evelyn's hand and squeezed it firmly, before leaning in slightly to kiss her back, a gesture that seemed to be a mixture of respect and affection. "I was looking for you," Nathan said in a deep, serene voice. Evelyn laughed softly. "I would never miss an evening like this," she replied, with a lightness that Mark didn't recognize. The glass in Mark's hand wavered. Who the hell was this man? And worse, why was Evelyn acting as if he were important? The ground seemed to have disappeared from under Mark's feet. Evelyn, the woman he dismissed as too simple, was now circulating among influential people, being recognized and praised. She was no longer invisible, and even more disturbingly, she was not alone. Nathan placed his hand naturally on Evelyn's waist and guided her to one of the high tables in the corner of the lobby. She followed him with calm steps, exchanging words with Richard along the way. She didn't look at Mark for a second, and that was what bothered him most. The signal echoed softly through the auditorium, indicating that the interval was over. The guests began to move back to their seats, and Mark followed mechanically, without taking his eyes off Evelyn. She walked calmly beside Nathan. The two of them moved with an irritating naturalness, as if this proximity was something routine. Evelyn didn't seem to force smiles or exaggerate. Everything about her seemed light. And that bothered Mark more than any provocation. The two of them sat a few rows in front of him, slightly to the left. Mark tried to convince himself that it didn't matter, that Evelyn was the past, and that he was exaggerating. But as the orchestra returned to the stage and the musicians tuned their instruments, his attention remained fixed on them. The lights dimmed, and the soft melody of violins filled the room. The delicate notes of the orchestra hung in the air, but Mark heard nothing. He was focused on Evelyn. She leaned slightly towards Nathan, saying something that made him smile. Nathan then bowed his head and murmured something in response. His expression relaxed, as if he were exactly where he wanted to be. Mark shifted in his chair, restless. He squeezed the arms of his chair, trying to force himself to focus on the music. But he couldn't. Nathan's fingers slid casually through Evelyn's hand, and she didn't just accept the touch, she entwined her fingers in his. Mark's chest tightened. He felt the blood throbbing in his temples. Then it happened. Nathan turned his face towards Evelyn, and with a naturalness that made him seem in control of the situation, leaned towards her and gently brushed his lips against hers. It wasn't a long kiss, nor was it bold. It was brief, discreet, but intimate enough to make it clear what was between them. Mark felt his stomach turn. "Mark," Claire called out, nudging his arm. "Are you listening to this piece? I love this part." He didn't answer. His heart seemed to be beating inside his ears, drowning out any sound around him. Evelyn laughed softly at something Nathan said, leaning closer to him. It was all so casual, so spontaneous, as if this was where she belonged now. Mark took a deep breath and looked away, trying to concentrate on the performance. The orchestra's notes grew in intensity, the violins and cellos growing together, as if they were competing with the whirlwind in his mind. But a moment later, his eyes returned to Evelyn. She was standing there, smiling with the tranquility of someone who didn't have a single weight on her conscience. How could she act like that? "Mark," Claire called out again, now more firmly. "What's going on?" "Nothing," he lied, his voice dry. "Nothing." She arched an eyebrow. "You've been restless ever since that woman showed up." "It's nothing," he repeated harshly. Claire narrowed her eyes but didn't insist. Mark went back to watching Evelyn. With every laugh, every glance exchanged with Nathan, he felt his discomfort grow. Evelyn hadn't just moved on, she was glowing. More than that, she looked better, more confident, more happy. Happy without him. Mark knew he had to control himself, but he could feel the restlessness spreading throughout his body. He no longer heard the music, no longer felt Claire's touch on his arm. He only saw Evelyn now leaning her head gently on Nathan's shoulder, the two of them looking so connected that Mark felt as if he were suffocating. He couldn't stand it any longer. Without thinking, he pushed the armchair in front of him slightly and started to get up. "Mark, what are you doing?" Claire hissed next to him, grabbing his arm. He ignored her. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn. She finally realized that he was watching her. Their gazes met for a brief moment, just seconds, but it was enough for Mark to notice the calm expression on her face. Evelyn wasn't scared. She wasn't uncomfortable. She just held his gaze and smiled. Not in a provocative or smug way. It was a calm smile, almost as if to say, "I'm fine. and you no longer have any power over that. Mark felt his chest burn. He leaned even further forward, almost running down the corridor. Claire tried to hold him again, but he pulled away. "Mark," she called out with a mixture of irritation and concern. But he didn't hear. He was already on his feet, and he was determined to talk to Evelyn. Mark stood in the corner of the row, leaning against the wall of the auditorium's side aisle. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn, who now stood up straight in her armchair, her hands resting gently on her lap. She was talking quietly to Nathan, but every now and then her eyes would scan the room, as if she were aware of Mark's unsettling presence. She was uncomfortable, he could tell, but tried hard not to show it. Mark crossed his arms, watching her every move. When Evelyn finally looked in his direction, he raised his hand, discreetly beckoning her over. She looked away deliberately, leaning over to whisper something in Nathan's ear. "She saw me." "She's just pretending not to," Mark insisted. He raised his hand again, this time more firmly. Evelyn remained motionless, keeping her gaze fixed on the orchestra. His irritation grew. He pulled his cell phone out of his pocket and typed quickly, "We need to talk. Now." Mark watched Evelyn rummage through her bag, pick up her phone and read the message. She kept her face neutral for a few seconds, but he noticed the brief moment when she took a deep breath, visibly annoyed. Soon after, Evelyn leaned over to Nathan and said something. He just nodded, and then she stood up. Mark felt relief mixed with anxiety as he watched her walk towards him, her heels clicking gently against the theatre floor. As soon as Evelyn approached, he signaled for her to follow him into the hall, away from the watchful eyes of the audience. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, crossing her arms as soon as they stopped near the main entrance. "Who is that man?" he blurted out. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, almost laughing. "Is that why you called me here? Answer me. Who is he?" "Nathan is someone important in my life." The vague answer made Mark's blood boil. "Since when?" he insisted. "And what's all this about a community gallery? What is this project?" Evelyn took a deep breath as if seeking patience. "This is none of your business." "None of my business?" His voice rose half a tone. "Evelyn, you just disappeared from my life, and now you turn up like this, surrounded by influential people as if—" "As if what?" She interrupted him, her voice firm and her eyes fixed on his. "As if I'd built something on my own." "I just want to understand," he said, gesturing impatiently. "How did you go from someone who didn't know how to fit in to someone who is now treated as if she were part of this social circle?" "Because I grew up, Mark." She smiled slightly, but there was bitterness in that smile. "I stopped waiting for you to let me be part of your life and decided to create my own." "That doesn't explain anything," he retorted. "I want to know what really happened." "And why should I explain anything to you?" Evelyn took a step closer, her voice lower but firm. "You don't have that right anymore." He froze, unable to find an answer that didn't sound pathetic. "You pushed me away, Mark." Her voice now carried something denser, almost a contained sorrow. "And I accepted it. I respected your decision. So why, now that I'm moving on, do you insist on appearing as if you still have some power over me?" "Because Mark began, but was interrupted. "Evelyn?" Nathan's firm, cold voice came from behind her. Mark turned and saw the man standing in the doorway of the hall. Nathan didn't look aggressive or upset, but his serious eyes showed that he didn't like what he saw at all. "Is everything all right in here?" Nathan asked, approaching. "Yes, it is," Evelyn said quickly, but Nathan kept his gaze fixed on Mark. "It doesn't look like it," he replied, his voice firm. "What's going on?" Mark took a step forward, trying to contain the irritation that was growing inside him. "I'm just talking to Evelyn," he replied dryly. "You seem to be bothering her," Nathan retorted, with a slight tone of defiance. The air seemed to get heavier. Evelyn turned to Mark, and for a moment he had the impression that she was about to say something soft, perhaps to calm the situation. But she didn't. Instead, Evelyn lifted her chin and said sharply, "Instead of worrying about me, Mark, go pay attention to the woman who is with you now." The words hit Mark like a punch in the gut. He didn't have time to react. "Come on, Nathan," said Evelyn, taking his arm. "It's not worth it." Mark stood in the same place, feeling ridiculous as he watched them walk away down the hall together. Claire appeared soon after, her eyes narrowed, clearly irritated. "What was that all about?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mark didn't answer. His gaze remained fixed on the doors through which Evelyn and Nathan had just exited. He should be angry. He should have forgotten about it and gone back to the performance. But instead, all he felt was a heavy emptiness, a nagging feeling that he had lost something he could never get back. Evelyn knew it wouldn't end there. She knew Mark well enough to know that he wouldn't accept this situation so easily. He had always been stubborn, proud, and unable to deal with anything that wasn't under his control. When she returned to the theater seats with Nathan, she tried to keep the conversation light, pretending to be calm, but inside she felt uncomfortable. Not because she still cared about Mark, but because she knew he wouldn't let things die there. It was his way of insisting. Hours later, Claire decided to leave on her own. She didn't even try to disguise her irritation. "Do what you want," she said, picking up her bag. "If you want to spend the evening dwelling on the past, that's your problem." Mark didn't try to stop her. When she left through the theater doors, he didn't even look back. He didn't go back to his apartment. Instead, he walked aimlessly through some of the city streets until he found a dimly lit bar with low music, just the kind of place where he could drown his thoughts. 2 shots of whiskey, then 2 more, and then a 5th shot, which made his vision go a little blurry. It was there at the dimly lit bar that he picked up his cell phone and typed a message to Evelyn. "Sorry about today. I just wanted to talk. Can we meet?" No reply. He sent another, "I just want to understand what happened to you. Please give me a chance to talk." Nothing. He drank another shot and wrote another message. "I know you still have feelings for me." This time he didn't even wait for a reply. He left the bar and took a cab home. When he opened the door to his apartment, Claire was sitting on the sofa in the living room, still awake. "Really?" She shot up as soon as he entered. "Is this how you solve your problems? By drinking and behaving like a rejected teenager?" Mark slammed the door shut harder than he intended. "Claire, I don't have the mind for this right now." "For this?" She stood up, crossing her arms. "You mean me, don't you? Because apparently your head is somewhere else." "I told you to be quiet," he replied harshly. Without bothering to take off his clothes or explain himself, Mark threw himself on the bed and blacked out almost immediately, the bitter taste of the drink still in his mouth. The next morning, Mark woke up with his head throbbing and sunlight streaming through the gap in the curtain. He dragged himself to the kitchen, drank 2 glasses of water, and swallowed a painkiller. When he picked up his cell phone, he saw that there was no answer from Evelyn. But it was when he opened the news that something caught his eye. Cultural event honors influential figures in the city. The featured photo showed Evelyn and Nathan side by side, smiling for the cameras. She was wearing an elegant, understated and sophisticated outfit, and Nathan was standing confidently next to her. The text highlighted the fact that Evelyn had been honored for her work in the community gallery and for the social impact her project was having. Mark stood still, staring at the screen. That wasn't the Evelyn he knew. He thought back to the nights they had spent together years ago, Evelyn always dreaming of bigger projects, wanting to help people, talking about purposes he thought were silly and irrelevant. He didn't take her seriously, but there she was, firm, respected, happy. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt an uncomfortable emptiness inside. "I still love her." The phrase popped into his mind like an inevitable confession. "I'm going to win her back." He picked up his cell phone and wrote another message. "I'm sorry for what happened yesterday. I overreacted. I just wanted to talk. Can you give me this chance?" Minutes later, Evelyn replied, "There's nothing more to talk about, Mark." He didn't take that as a definitive no. After all, Evelyn had always been a sentimental woman. She just needed the right gesture, something symbolic, flowers. He had a huge bouquet of white lilies delivered, Evelyn's favorite flowers, accompanied by a handwritten card. "I still think about you. I always have. Give me a chance to make things right." He imagined the scene, Evelyn receiving the flowers, smiling, maybe even crying a little. She would send him a discreet message saying that she needed time. He would have the opportunity to show that he had changed. But that's not what happened. Evelyn was on the street, walking home with the bouquet and handed it to a homeless woman. She didn't even read the card or say anything to him. He felt his blood boil. Why was she being so stubborn? Mark refused to believe that he had lost Evelyn forever. He was sure that in time she would realize that she still loved him. Deep down, he always got what he wanted. Evelyn would be no different. However, there was a part of him that didn't want to give up Claire so quickly. After all, if Evelyn really didn't come back, Claire would still be a good alternative and he'd like to show her off to society. "What's going on with you?" Claire asked from across the room. She looked at him with a suspicious expression. Mark forced a smile. "Oh, nothing. I'm just sorting some things out." "What things?" she insisted, narrowing her eyes. "Because honestly, you've been acting strange since yesterday." "I just need you to be patient," he said, rubbing his face with his hands. "That's all. Patience." Claire crossed her arms. Patience for what exactly? He didn't answer, because even he didn't know for sure. All he knew was that Evelyn still loved him. She had to. And he was willing to do whatever it took to make her realize that. Mark couldn't get Evelyn out of his mind. He knew he needed to do something bolder, something that showed he was willing to change, to do whatever it took to get her back. A ring. That was it. He knew exactly what to choose. Evelyn had always been in love with the delicate jewelry in that sophisticated store in the city center. She used to spend minutes admiring the windows when they went for a walk together. He remembered perfectly how she would smile as she looked at the minimalist designs and sparkling stones. Mark entered the store and carefully browsed the displays. He wanted something special, not over the top, but significant enough to prove that he was serious. "Can I help you?" asked the saleswoman, smiling politely. "I want a ring," replied Mark resolutely. "Something elegant, discreet, but striking." Minutes later, he left the store with a little black box and the certainty that he was on the right track. In the late afternoon, Mark parked in front of Evelyn's building. He was nervous but convinced that this gesture would be enough to soften her heart. "She still loves me. She's just trying to convince herself otherwise." He typed the apartment number into the intercom and waited. "Hello?" Evelyn's voice sounded cold and dry. "Evelyn, it's me." "I know who you are," she replied without emotion. "What do you want?" "I want to talk to you," he said. "Please, it's important." "Mark," I said, "no, just come down." His voice shook a little, but he didn't give in. "I just need 5 minutes." There was a pause. For a moment, he thought she was going to hang up. 5 minutes, she reluctantly gave in. "And only because I want to make it clear that this has to end." Mark ignored the last sentence and took a deep breath. This is going to work. Evelyn appeared at the entrance to the building a few minutes later, wearing jeans and a light sweater. She had no makeup on and her hair was tied up in a simple bun, and yet she looked flawless. "What's wrong?" she asked, crossing her arms. Mark opened the little black box, revealing the ring. It was a delicate piece of white gold with a bright blue stone in the center, Evelyn's favorite color. She looked at the jewel and, for a moment, Mark saw a spark of surprise in her eyes. "I know you love this store," he said, trying to sound confident. "I chose something that would suit you." "Mark," she began, her voice lower. "I want another chance," he interrupted. "I know I made mistakes. I know I pushed you away when you just wanted to be a part of my life." And then he started reminiscing about the good times they'd had. He talked about the trips, the candlelit dinners, the nights they spent talking for hours about dreams that he thought were silly at the time. "I know you still love me," he said with an almost desperate firmness. Evelyn stared at him for long seconds, her eyes fixed on his. "I can't believe you're still like that," she murmured, shaking her head. "Like what?" he replied, confused. "Like this. Thinking you can solve everything with pretty words and expensive presents." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "You haven't changed at all, Mark." He opened his mouth to retort, but was interrupted by a firm voice behind her. "Evelyn, is everything all right here? Nathan?" He appeared next to her, his expression serious and his gaze directly on Mark. "Yes," Evelyn answered quickly, turning to Nathan naturally. "I was just giving him something back." She took the box with the ring and held it out to Mark. "I don't want this," she said firmly. "Evelyn," he tried to argue. "It's over. she said quietly, but with conviction. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away with Nathan by her side. Mark stood on the sidewalk, still holding the open box. He was sure that Evelyn had only refused because Nathan was there. She was trying to keep up appearances, trying to disguise what she really felt. She'll break up with him. She'll realize that she still loves me. She just needs time. With that thought, Mark closed the box and headed home, still convinced that he was in control of the situation. Mark entered the apartment and found Claire sitting in the living room, fiddling with her cell phone. She didn't even raise her eyes when he walked past. He went straight to the bedroom, took off his jacket, and threw it over a chair. He needed a shower to clear his head. The hot water ran over his face, but it didn't relieve the tension that was growing inside him. Evelyn wouldn't leave his mind. He was sure that she only refused the ring because Nathan was around. Deep down he knew she still felt something. He could see it in her eyes. She'll come back to me, she just needs time. When he came out of the bathroom, Claire was already in the bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed. She held the small black box in her hands, the lid open, revealing the ring. She raised her eyes slowly, staring at him. "What's this, Mark?" she asked, her voice firm. "What is it, Mark?" Claire repeated, holding out the open box with the ring shining inside. Mark hesitated for a second, but then let out a short laugh as if amused by the situation. "This was a surprise for you?" he said, crossing his arms and forcing a smile. "But you seem to have ruined everything with your unwarranted jealousy." Claire blinked in surprise. "What? I was going to give it to you later," he continued, approaching her slowly. "I was waiting for the right moment." She looked at him suspiciously, but then her eyes went back to the ring. The sparkle of the jewel reflected on her fingers, and for a moment Mark felt his doubt turn to pride. "Were you going to give me that ring?" Her voice became softer, almost emotional. "Of course I did," he lied, more confident now. "But you always spoil things when you get insecure like that." Claire put the box down on the bed and walked over to him. "So why didn't you say anything to me?" "Because I wanted it to be special," he said, his voice lower. He put his hands on her waist and gently pulled her close. "I wanted it to be a surprise." She didn't answer. She just slid her hands down his chest, feeling Mark's warm breath mingle with hers. Then, without warning, Claire kissed him. An intense kiss, full of desire and need. For a brief moment Mark hesitated. He closed his eyes and, involuntarily, his mind brought up the image of Evelyn. He remembered her touch, the soft perfume he knew so well. Evelyn. The desire that overwhelmed him then was almost desperate. He grabbed Claire by the nape of the neck and kissed her with even more intensity, as if he were trying to quench a longing he didn't even know he had. Claire sighed against his lips, surrendering to his body. Mark pushed her gently against the wall, his hands eagerly exploring every curve. "I knew it," she murmured, as he pressed his body against hers. "I knew you were in love with me." Mark slid his lips down her neck, whispering words that he himself had no idea where they came from. He said sweet things, vague promises and choked declarations, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Claire gasped and clung to his shoulders, as if she didn't want the moment to end. Right there, leaning against the bedroom wall, they gave in to desire. It was intense, almost urgent, as if they were both trying to prove something. Claire trying to prove that he really loved her, and Mark trying to forget that he actually wanted someone else. When it was all over, Claire lay down next to him, her fingers sliding gently down his chest. "You look different today," she commented with a satisfied smile. "So intense, almost as if you were trying to convince yourself of something." Mark remained silent, staring at the ceiling. "I knew you loved me," she continued, resting her chin on his chest. "That ring, and what we've just done, I'm sure you're completely in love with me." She closed her eyes and sighed, relaxing in his arms. Mark, however, couldn't rest. His body was still there with Claire, but his mind was elsewhere, in Evelyn's eyes, in the discreet smile she gave before turning her back on him, in the perfume he tried to find on Claire, but it wasn't there. He closed his eyes tightly, feeling the weight of the lie he had created for himself. It wasn't over. Evelyn was still going to come back to him. He was sure of it. The next morning, Claire woke up before Mark. She stretched, smiling to herself as she remembered the intense night they'd had. For her, it had been clear proof that Mark was in love. The ring, the way he touched her, the words whispered during the night, everything pointed to it. But as she turned to look at him sleeping next to her, something didn't seem right. Mark was restless, breathing heavily, as if even in his dreams he was bothered by something. And when Claire reached over to stroke his hair, he just turned away, walking away without realizing it. Why is he like this? Over breakfast, the bad feeling increased. Claire tried to talk, but Mark barely responded. He was distracted, fiddling with his cell phone, looking distant and frowning. "What's wrong?" she asked, forcing a smile. "You're so pensive." "Nothing," he replied dryly. She laughed softly and tried to lighten the mood. "Well, if it's about yesterday." Her hand slid up his arm. "I loved it. You were so passionate." "Uh-huh," he murmured, still not looking at her. Claire felt her chest tighten. He's not happy. He's sorry. After coffee, Mark said he was going to lie down for a while. The tiredness and the hangover were taking their toll. When he went to his room, Claire stayed in the living room. She tried to watch some program but couldn't concentrate. Her mind was spinning, going over every detail of his strange behavior. Then Mark's cell phone, lying on the coffee table, vibrated. Claire looked at the device. Her heart beat faster. No, I'm not that kind of woman. But then she remembered all the times he'd been evasive, the way he'd avoided talking about his feelings, and the almost forced way he'd insisted that ring was for her. Without thinking, Claire picked up her cell phone and typed in the password. She knew it by heart. Mark had never bothered to change it. The screen unlocked, and that's when everything came crashing down. The messages to Evelyn were there. "I still think about you. I know you still love me. I bought something special for you. I want to give it to you personally." Claire felt her hands shaking. Her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to echo in her ears, but she kept going. She scrolled down and found the message that clarified everything. "The ring is from your favorite store. I know you'll love it." Claire closed her eyes and took a deep breath. A hot tear ran down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. "I'm not going to cry over this idiot." She got up, went to her room, and began to collect her clothes. She threw everything into her suitcase anyway, feeling her face burn with anger and humiliation. Before leaving, she went over to the bedside table, where Mark kept some jewelry, and took out some rings, chains, and an expensive watch that he loved to show off. "You want to play with feelings, Mark? Let him keep the loss." In the hallway of the building, Claire stopped for a moment and typed one last message to him. "I saw your messages. The ring wasn't for me. You're a coward and a liar. I loved you, but I'm not an idiot. Good luck on your own." She pressed send, slung her bag over her shoulder, and disappeared down the street. He would never see her again. Hours later, Mark woke up, and for a moment felt at peace, until he realized that there was a great silence in the apartment. "Claire," he called out, his voice hoarse. There was no reply. He left the bedroom, still a little dizzy, and found the apartment empty. Only then did he see his cell phone on the table. There was an unread message. "I saw your messages. The ring wasn't for me." He read the entire text. When he had finished, he sighed heavily and threw the phone on the sofa. For a moment, he felt a slight tightening in his chest, a nagging feeling that he was losing control of everything. But he quickly pushed the thought away. Claire had never mattered that much. What mattered now was Evelyn. "Evelyn still loves me. She just needs time." He looked at his cell phone again and opened the photo gallery. He stopped at an old photo of him and Evelyn, the two of them smiling on the balcony of a guest house where they had spent a weekend together. She was wearing a white dress, her hair loose, and that smile he thought she'd always have around. Mark squeezed the photo as if he could reach it through the screen. "She'll come back to me. She has to." Now that Claire was out of the way, he was going to put his real plan into practice. He wasn't going to be alone. The next few days were torture for Mark. He tried texting Evelyn, but was ignored. He tried calling, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Evelyn didn't want to listen to him, and that only made him more determined. He needed to be more incisive. After much insistence, he heard from a mutual friend that Evelyn would be attending a new exhibition at the community gallery, an event she had organized herself. For Mark, this was the perfect chance. I'm going to surprise her. I'm going to show her that I can be the man she deserves. On the night of the event, Mark put on his best suit and went to the gallery. The space was elegant, decorated with vibrant paintings and modern sculptures. Important guests were passing through, discussing art and culture, and then he saw her. Evelyn was radiant. She wore a navy blue dress that elegantly marked her figure, her hair tied up in a delicate bun, a few loose strands framing her face. She was smiling sincerely, chatting with guests and receiving compliments on the event, and next to her was Nathan. He was attentive to Evelyn, listening to her with a discreet smile, the kind of smile that reveals that there is much more than just friendship between two people. Mark felt his stomach turn, but he didn't back down. He waited for an opportune moment, and, when Evelyn moved away to talk to one of the artists, Mark approached. "Evelyn," he called out, his voice low, almost pleading. She turned around, and her smile disappeared instantly. "What are you doing here?" she asked dryly. I just wanted to talk to you," he said, trying not to sound desperate. "Just a minute, please." Evelyn looked around hesitantly. "Okay, 1 minute." Mark took advantage of the gap and led her to a more secluded corner of the gallery. "Evelyn," he began, reaching into his inside jacket pocket and pulling out a slightly crumpled white envelope. "I've kept this all this time." He handed her the envelope. "What's this?" she asked, suspicious. "Just open it." Hesitating, Evelyn opened the envelope. Inside were a series of old photos, pictures of her and Mark, smiling together, on trips, dinners, and intimate moments that seemed to have been taken in another life. And alongside the photos, there were also letters and notes that Evelyn had written to him in the past. Sweet words, future plans, promises full of hope. For a few seconds, she just stood there, motionless, taking it all in. Mark swallowed. "I never threw it away because deep down I knew you were the best part of my life. I know that I hurt you, that I treated you as if you weren't important. But these memories," he pointed to the photos, "have always been with me." His voice wavered. "I don't want to lose you again." For a moment, Evelyn looked shaken. She held the photos and letters delicately. Her eyes locked on an image of the two of them laughing on the balcony of a seaside inn, a trip she always said had been the happiest of their lives. "I know you still love me," Mark said softly. "I saw it in your eyes that night." She lifted her face to his, and Mark felt hope rise in his chest. "I'm succeeding." Nathan's voice sounded from across the hall. "Evelyn," he called, attentive. She blinked rapidly and closed the envelope. "I have to get back." Evelyn turned around hastily, but Mark grabbed her arm. "Evelyn, please," he begged. "Don't end it like this." She stood still for a few seconds, holding the envelope tightly. Then, with a heavy sigh, she handed it back to him. "It doesn't make sense anymore," she said, her voice firm but serene. Mark felt his heart sink. "What do you mean it doesn't make sense?" He shook his head. This is our story. It's everything we've lived through." "Exactly," she replied. "It's what we lived through in the past." She took a step back and looked at him with an expression that mixed sadness and certainty. "I've waited for you for a long time," said Evelyn. "I waited for you to notice me, to listen to me, to realize that I was on your side. But you left me behind." Mark tried to interrupt, but she held up her hand, telling him to shut up. "When you pushed me away, I finally realized that I don't need someone who makes me feel small." Her voice softened a little. "And Nathan looks at me like I'm the most important thing in the world." Mark was speechless. He watched her walk away, returning to Nathan's side. The man put his hand gently on her waist and looked at her tenderly, the kind of look Mark had never offered. Mark still tried to insist in the days that followed. He sent flowers again, wrote long letters, and even showed up at Evelyn's building one last time. But she didn't answer, and then he finally understood. He had lost. There was no more Evelyn to win back. She had fallen in love with Nathan, and more importantly, she had learned to love herself away from him. Months later, Evelyn and Nathan were walking hand in hand through the park on a sunny morning. She laughed at something he said, her heart as light and peaceful as it had been in a long time. Suddenly she spotted someone sitting on one of the benches, Mark. He was alone, holding a cold cup of coffee, his eyes downcast and lost. His face looked tired, defeated. For an instant, Evelyn felt a pang in her chest, not of longing, but of compassion. Nathan noticed her gaze. "Do you want to go there?" he asked gently. Evelyn looked at Mark once more. He seemed so distant, so broken. But that was no longer her problem. "No," she answered, smiling at Nathan. "I'm exactly where I should be." And hand in hand, they walked on, leaving Mark behind with his memories. Mark remained seated, watching Evelyn walk away next to Nathan. For a long time he had believed that she would come back. He had been sure of that. But now he knew she wouldn't. Evelyn had learned to live without him, and this time Mark had no one to blame but himself. What do you think about what happened to Mark? Did he deserve a second chance with Evelyn? Leave your opinion in the comments, like the video,
I hope you enjoyed
subscribe
this
to the
thrilling
channel.
journey. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback inspires more epic tales.